Hello, dissidents. Welcome to the third installment of our pre-recorded interview series, which we just launched. Very excited to welcome our latest guests. One is an author and host of the Glenn Show, and he is joined by his wife and supporter, aspiring DJ, retired cybersecurity consultant, LaJuan. So let's welcome Glenn and LaJuan Loury. Guys, great to meet you. Thanks so much for being here.
Welcome.
Keaton, Russell, good to be with you guys.
Happy All right. Well, I want to plug your book right at the top here. It's called Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. And we were put in touch with you guys via the old gray lady, via the New York Times. Our name just happened to come up in a piece that was written in the New York Times about you, Glenn. He knows it's important to admit mistakes. He's made many. So this was listed as an opinion piece. I guess it was an interview slash review of your new memoir. But we couldn't help but notice here, he still got to check himself. Maybe he's wrong about your various political persuasions. This was in reference to his wife of 7 years, LaJuan, is strongly committed to her progressive beliefs. Their marriage, he says, has had far-reaching implications for my own intellectual life. Together, they listen to the left-wing podcast she favors, The Jimmy Dore Show, Max Blumenthal, DueDissidence. Not only is he exposed to different ideas, but out of his respect for his wife, he has to self-interrogate a bit. So we're like, hey, you know what? If you guys are fans, maybe we'll reach out and see if you'd like to come on. And so we emailed Glenn, and I got... in response from Glenn, one of my favorite emails that we've ever gotten was from Mr. Glenn Loury. He says, my wife, thanks for reaching out. My wife is a big fan of the show, and I absorb it passively from across the kitchen table. Some of the highest praise we've ever received. So that was how we met you guys.
That was a notch above the guy who called us a couple of morons.
Yeah, right. Exactly. My wife's a fan, and I sometimes listen secondhand. So yeah, it's great to meet you guys. I just had a baby, so I'm not going to pretend that I am hyper prepared for this as much as I should be. I'll confess that at the outset. But I did listen to excerpts of your book on audio because I have the unlimited Kindle thing. And Russ has compiled a list of great questions. So I'll kick it off to Russell Dobler here.
All right. So to start off, you have a pretty fascinating background. I don't think a lot of people really know all this about you. You grew up on the south side of Chicago. You describe your section as working class, but you were close to the Robert Taylor homes, which were desperately poor. So you were in very close proximity to that. Your family had a range of backgrounds. Your father wound up working for the IRS. You had an uncle who was a successful lawyer until his own demons, you describe, kind of destroyed that. You had an aunt who owned an apartment building but dealt some weed on the side. This is not the usual background for an MIT trained economist. So you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, I mean, it was not an unusual story for somebody coming off of the south side of Chicago, born in the late 1940s. But it was working class, middle class, some shopkeepers and stuff. I was lucky to grow up in a tree-lined street, backyard with fruit trees and, people trying to maintain a certain amount of respectability and whatnot. But as I say in the book, I mean, it was easy to cross over to the other side of the line, and there was a lot of other different kinds of stuff going on in that same general social milieu. And I was privy to that, or to a certain degree, a party to that. And that echoes throughout the course of the story I tell about my life in the book.
Now, you described, this was very interesting, and this is something that keeps coming up. So eventually you wind up at Northwestern University. You'd been a very good student at school. But even so, by that time, you have a wife, You have one child, and shortly after you had a second with your first wife, Charlene.
Yes.
But you describe your fellow Black students as kind of fall radicals, as being from more elevated backgrounds than yours, and describing the struggle. And you say at one point, talk to my aunt, talk to my father about struggle. You don't really know about struggle. And that seems to keep coming up in the way you relate to Black radicals, which I would suggest, and I think you have the self-awareness, you pretty much say it at different points. This naturally led into your antagonism towards certain civil rights leaders and institutions later on, or am I mischaracterizing it?
Well, it didn't help. I mean, you have to understand, I was a father at the age of 18, and again at 19, and again at 21. I had to drop out of college. I mean, I was already flunking out because I was not going to class, and I was, playing pool and, drinking vodka at 2:00 in the afternoon and chasing girls and stuff like that. And just, a kid finally set free from the constraints of close supervision of parents and elders, and, doing my own thing. And, I didn't do well in school. So I dropped out. I went to a community college. I got discovered by one of my professors there. He was a Northwestern alum. They had a program to bring kids from the South Side to Northwestern. I got interviewed. They offered me a scholarship. I ended up in Northwestern. Now I'm working a full-time job, 8 hours a night at a factory as a clerk, and getting on the public transit and making my way up to Evanston, Illinois, leafy green suburb, upper middle class. And the Black kids who were on campus there, by and large, they came from comfortable families and middle class backgrounds and whatnot. I'm not, they weren't rich. They weren't as rich as the white kids were, but they were, they were doing okay as far as I was. And I had a huge chip on my shoulder about these Negroes. They didn't know anything about what the ghetto was really like, and yet they wanted to be the blackest, the most radical, the most Black power. And I'm saying Black, I know Black. I know the ghetto. I know the, honky tonk taverns. I know the back alleys. I know how you cop drugs in the projects. I know, who the gangsters are. I can tell by the way they walk and the way, I've been in pool halls. I can get by, don't tell me anything about Black. And that was kind of my attitude. And it was, maybe 3 parts, them being snooty bourgeois Negroes. And it was 1 part me having a huge chip on my shoulder because I had to work 8 hours a day before I came to class.
So if I could just interject for a minute here, because I would like to ask LaJuan. So, we're talking about Glenn's background. The New York Times piece, categorized you as a progressive. Is that an accurate description of your politics, and how has your background shaped what your politics are? I would assume you are a progressive, but I can't assume that what the New York Times says is accurate.
It's accurate.
Oh, there you go. It is accurate. Oh, they got it right.
It's accurate.
All right, so they're 1 for 2.
This isn't a war, Keaton.
They're wrong on weapons of mass destruction, but they categorize your politics correctly. There you go. That makes up for it.
Yes, I am progressive. I grew up basically poor. My mother raised 4 children by herself, and we were on welfare, and we were kicked off because my mother earned too much money, but it still wasn't enough money to feed 4 children and support them. She had 3 girls. Can you imagine raising 3 girls by yourself and all their needs? We were all within 1 to 3 years of each other, and it was tough. It was just tough. There'd be times my mother could only give us 25 cents to go to school with, and all we could buy was a honey bun to eat for the whole day. So, yeah, I know what it's like, and I just can't forget what it's like. I can't forget what it's like for other people who are still struggling. It bothers me. That's why I so much identify with those who are struggling. I'm not struggling anymore. However, it's something that's still visceral for me.
All right. That it's whenever you do these interviews, it's always the old line about boxing. Everyone's got a plan until they get hit. So I'm gonna go off book here for a second since you brought that up. So I was talking to Glenn about this before we went on, and I don't know if you've heard me say it. I don't know how much time you have to watch the show. I grew up with a single mother in a 1-bedroom apartment on welfare, and I've often said because of that, I am sympathetic to a lot of views that are associated often with Black conservatives regarding welfare and the damage that it can do to a household. I don't know if you feel that was your experience. I definitely felt when I came to manhood that it had left me with a lot of disadvantages regarding understanding how to take care of myself, just the basics of doing taxes, man. I never saw anybody do that. I didn't know anything about it. It just wasn't even in my landscape. And Glenn, I'm not even sure what your views are on those kinds of programs, but I'm kind of in the middle. I think very often when you come up from under, a lot of people who come up from under can wind up being, and you mentioned Nietzsche in your book, can wind up being very Nietzschean. It's the force of your will, and you did it, and that's it. And a lot of people who come up from the streets who succeed wind up thinking like that. I would say I probably landed somewhere in the middle. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm one of those people who worries a lot about the dependency problem, and that helping someone is actually a hard thing to do, not an easy thing to do. The easiest thing to do is to give them money. The harder thing to do is to be prudential and wise about when to enable and when to let them have to deal with the consequences of their own irresponsible actions. And this is a bone of contention or a point of difference between my wife and myself. Yeah, I do take pride in the self-made man character of my own story, although no one gets there alone, as Obama pointed out. You didn't build that. And it's true, without all kinds of different influences, including governmental program, the affirmative action from Northwestern University, a family background that I was fortunate to have, because even though there were some negative things, there was a lot of positive stuff going on. Mm-hmm. My aunt took my mother and my sister and I in when my mom was a young and not especially responsible single mother, and my aunt was a very well-established, striving middle-class businesswoman and with a good home. I grew up in a neighborhood much better than I might have otherwise grown up in,
right.
Much better in certain respects than the one that my wife grew up in, the third ward of inner city Houston, where George Floyd originated. Her brother, my wife's brother, and George Floyd were in effect classmates. They knew each other, coming along roughly the same age, the same neighborhood. So yeah, the conversation between LaJuan and I often turns on me saying, these people need to get their stuff together. They need to stop running down the street, firing pistols out of the window at their gang rivals and killing the baby sitting on their grandmother's knee. They need to get a job. They need to clean up their act. They need to whatever. And her saying, try walking a mile in their moccasins. It's not so easy. Don't be so judgmental. Everybody's got a story. You think they want to be poor? This kind of thing. I don't mean to speak for her, but this is what I think is one of the points of creative friction between the two of us.
LaJuan,
so
do you
what
have a response to that?
Yeah.
I feel like I'm a marriage counselor here. I feel like I'm doing therapy. No, how did that make you feel, LaJuan, when he said that?
As long as he doesn't call me Jane LaJuan, you ignorant slut, then we're good. Yes, we do have points of contention regarding that, because I grew up not only in Third Ward, but we lived in the suburbs. But the suburbs, there was a housing project called the Aristocrat Apartments, and the wealthy Black kids in the neighborhood, the middle class Black kids, called us the Aristorats, because we were the poor kids, and we had to ride the same bus as the kids from Brentwood. So, and there's lots of stuff going on in that project. But those families were struggling. And I just think that, yes, my husband is too judgmental. Yes, there are people who commit crimes. I believe they commit crimes out of desperation. I'm a big Thomas Paine fan. And Thomas Paine's position was out of poverty results crime and all kinds of other things. So, and I'm a living testimony to it. I didn't commit any crimes, but I saw a lot of it. Our house was burglarized. Our apartment was burglarized many times, and it's something we had to deal with.
Well, but speaking to the culture argument, and Glenn, I think this was your first major paper, your thesis. You got into social capital, and this applies, I think, to race as well as to class. You argued that part of your opportunities are not simply defined by the money available, it's also defined by the skills available in your community and in your family, that you're going to tend to rise to the level of available skills that the people around you have. And that's a problem that can't really be solved with money. I assume you've both spoken about that. Would you agree with Glenn's views on that?
So not everyone handles money in the same manner. A little extra money for us would have been welcomed. It would have made sure that we had a consistent meal every day. We would have been able to do certain other things, like my mother been able to put gas in the tank, fill up the tank every time. I think that at a point, yes, you have to be able to say, okay, I don't need this anymore. But when do you get to that point where you don't need assistance anymore? When food prices continue to increase, just the cost of living, rent keeps going up. When do you have to stop and say, okay, I don't need this help anymore?
Well, I think.
Go ahead, Kate.
I think money matters to a large extent in a macro sense. Bernie Sanders got a lot of shit for repeating ad nauseum, 90% of all new wealth goes to the top 1%. Well, if that is true, and it seems like that is true, that does mean less money going around for everybody else, which means whatever skills you have, it's going to be harder to get your hands on that money if that money is being funneled to the already richest 1% of people. And so that affects the opportunity. And I think that is a major hindrance when it comes to creating a system where you can have economic empowerment that transcends this dependency question, right? We interviewed about a month and a half ago Omali Yeshitela from the African People's Socialist Party. We're going to interview someone from their legal team soon because he might be going to jail soon on bogus Russiagate charges. That's a different story. But he criticizes the welfare state from the left. And what his organization has done is they have built basically self-sustaining economic systems within their communities. And they have sought economic self-determination through that model. And so I think a bigger question than simply, I think more than making it a question about dependency, I think it can also be a question about how do you build an economic system that transcends dependency, that empowers everybody? Because the what we have now is clearly empowering those who are already very wealthy and making it very, very difficult for anybody who was born to modest means to get a foothold, to buy a house. I mean, we all know the numbers.
Yes.
Well, Glenn, before you weigh in on that, I also want to mention you wrote a later paper basically arguing for a redistributive policy where wealthy families would have their wealth funneled to poorer families. So what are your views today on this?
Well, it's not a simple either or thing. I think I did in the same thesis in which
he
I
surrendered
wrote
to the communists.
Same dissertation, MIT, 1976, a long time ago. My PhD, and I introduced the term social capital as a reference to the fact that money is not everything. Money is money. It's not nothing. But it doesn't substitute for parents who are disciplined and raise the kids and are responsible in their, doesn't substitute for peer influences that are affirmative of the kind of things that you need to do in order to get ahead in life, things of this kind. The role models and examples, if I grow up in a neighborhood where there are very few fathers, where nobody's getting up at 8 o'clock in the morning and going to work, that's going to have an impact on me beyond whether or not an additional dollar comes in from the welfare system. So money is not everything. Values, norms, the example of disciplined living on behalf of responsible exercise of your prerogatives, this is also very important. And I wanted to say that one of the things that slavery and Jim Crow did for many urban Black communities is create a circumstance in which the beneficial consequences of that kind of social network connectivity were missing, and money wouldn't alone substitute for those things. So that's a point that I would still make. I don't know how my wife would react to it, but the other thing I'd say is money is not nothing. And in the 1970s, when I was writing that dissertation at MIT, which is a relatively, Democrat, center left kind of ethos, it wasn't hard left, it wasn't radical, it wasn't Marxist, but it was Keynesian and friendly to the welfare state, and wanted to find work for people, and job training and things of this kind. The fact that wealthy families can do so much with their money for their children, and poor families do not have available to them those resources, that matters, because the kids of poor families on average are just as potentially productive as the kids of rich families. I want to say there's nothing intrinsically better on average about a kid in a rich family than a poor family, but the resources available to develop that potential talent are scarce for poor families. And so I tried to make a technical theoretical argument that redistribution from rich to poor could both reduce inequality, but also enhance efficiency. That was kind of my novel observation. You could get both better efficiency and more equity if you took advantage of the fact that poor families could use some resources to invest in the development of their children. This kind of idea.
Well, absolutely, and this is the Marxist in me, because this is the part of me that thinks that those kinds of economic factors influence the culture in such a major way. Back when I was an Uber driver, I'll keep this as quick as I can. I used to drive this woman, because when you drive in the same area and you're in a small town, you get the same riders, a couple times a week if you drive every day and you keep the same shift. So this woman who was a manager of the Holiday Inn, and at like 2 o'clock she would go home, and she lived in a very modest apartment, kind of a rundown complex. And she was talking to me about how as soon as she gets home, she takes the baby and her husband goes to work, and she and her husband never see each other ever. They both work 7 days a week, different shifts. The child is never with both parents at the same time, because the money they make is not sufficient to make childcare worth it, because then they may as well lose one of their jobs, because one of their jobs goes right to childcare. So I agree, Glenn, with everything you're saying about personal responsibility and commitment and all of that. I think those are wonderful values that I try to live up to as best I can and try to instill in my guys. But when you go on Craigslist and you look in general labor employment listings and the top wage is $16 an hour, that is the ceiling at which those values get you when you live month to month, right? And that's not conducive to instilling the kind of values in people that I think we can all agree are positive.
Yeah, I just want to say for the record, I agree with that. You mentioned someone, I don't know the person, so I won't be able to repeat the name, but was a radical critique from the left of the welfare system. And I was thinking, yeah, I see that argument, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. I mean, you got a structure that's messed up and that doesn't give the little guy a chance. And then you have this little superficial little thing where, I'm drowning. Okay, I'll throw you a lifeline. Not enough to get you out of the water, but enough so that you don't go completely under. when the deeper problem might be better wages for working people and so on like that. Unions, higher minimum wage, stuff that a neoliberal like me chafes at a little bit, but that I hear constantly from this woman sitting here.
Well, his name is Omala Yeshitela, and you have a popular YouTube show. You should absolutely try to interview him. That would be a fascinating episode.
That would be a really interesting. Well,
and he might not be a free man much longer, so you should probably get on it. I'll give you his contact.
Get on him while he's still out. Well, Glenn, I mean, part of why I find a lot of these views understandable and relatable, and I even agree up to a certain point. And you went ahead and ascended to the heights. We'll get into that more. You almost wound up in the Reagan administration, and yet you had a whole second life that was very much impacted by the culture. I think you would say the culture and community you came from. If you had not come from that kind of an environment, it probably never would have occurred to you to have this whole second life of pool halls and prostitutes and cocaine. Now, to a much lesser extreme, I got off the streets, and you know what? I kept getting arrested for years. For years, I kept taking arrests. Nothing major, but the way I conducted myself, even after I had an education, I had my own businesses, I had theaters in the East Village, I would get arrested in the middle of running my theaters. I would go to jail for some nonsense. That didn't happen to the people I knew from the suburbs who did not come from that background. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that it's not just money. It's not just money. If you have a whole cultural milieu like that, it has an impact on you. Money is something, as you said, as we all agree. It's not everything. But how do you solve that? That is the problem. How do you really solve that in a way that is not a police state, right? I mean, what do? You round everybody up and put them in re-education camps? Like, what do you do to fix that?
I'm about to make a confession. My book is called Lady Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. I'm about to make a confession. So I was coming out of the Black community in Southside Chicago, not poor, but not rich either, and close to a lot of, dicey stuff, and knowing my way around the inner city, the projects, the ghetto. But I was also on a fast track to a wholly different life altogether. I just told you that I was a student at Northwestern with children and working a full-time job. And when I left that, I went east. I went east to MIT, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University, the ultra elite European intellectual influence, very prominent, cultural thing, what wine do I drink at dinner, what fork when there are 3 forks at the table, and this kind of thing. And if I had a chip on my shoulder with respect to those upper middle class Black kids at Northwestern, I definitely had senses of insecurity and did I really belong and whatnot in this new milieu that I was interested entering into. And I didn't want to lose touch with my roots. I wanted to remain somehow authentic. I didn't want to be one of those, I call them the Negro cognoscenti, these elite upper middle class Black people. I wanted to be real. I wanted to be down with the brothers in the hood, this kind of. And I found an outlet that allowed me to maintain a certain sense of my own perception of authenticity by hanging out in the honky-tonk bars in inner city Boston, by changing my uniform from, jeans and a plaid shirt with a pocket protector going to classes at MIT to, bell-bottom pants. I mean, it was the 1970s, man. And, a flowery shirt.
That was the real crime.
And I could go into these clubs and I could get by. I could manage. I could carry, I find my way through that. And I took a certain pride in that. I took pride in knowing who the dope dealer was. Pride in being able to go up to a guy who sells trinkets off of a tabletop near a public transit station for a living and who plays 5-minute chess against anybody who comes along as a pastime and making really good friends with that guy and hanging out with him and his associates because they were authentic, real Black people. So for me, part of the complexity of why it is that I ended up in the double life posture was that I was trying to stay in touch with something that I thought was authentically Black. I am not defending that position. You can say that that's really perverse. That's how you identified Blackness, with the ugliest and seamiest underside of life in the inner city. But the truth of the matter is, I knew how to cop weed in the projects. And I took pride in that. And I knew the guy who was, fencing stolen goods, just like my uncle used to do out of the back of his barbershop when I was coming along. And I took pride in that. And I could change my uniform and walk down the streets in some of these neighborhoods, and no one would ever guess for a minute that I had just come across the river from MIT.
Yes. Isn't an element of that a combination of imposter syndrome and survivor's guilt?
Well, I mean, if we're going to pretend to be psychologists, yeah, I suppose that's the way that we would put it. I wouldn't have had the insight to quite put it that way. But yeah, there were elements of both of those things. Imposter syndrome. Do I really belong? Am I really good enough to be here? Survivor's guilt. Why me? Right. I'm not really any different than anybody else that you would have pulled off of the streets of Chicago in the late 1960s or early 1970s. And
yeah,
here I am.
I struggled with that for a long time. I was worse than a lot of the kids I grew up with. I would steal cars. I was dealing drugs out of my house. Why do I get to just go to college and take off the uniform and go live like one of these rich kids? Why do I get to do that? That was very hard for me for a long time. So we mentioned before Nietzsche, and that was very interesting to me because you talked about how these Black students, I think of this as a modern concept, how a lot of Black students would ridicule you for reading these white Europeans, which you resisted. And that idea, I would imagine at the time, was pretty fringe and pretty niche and pretty academic. How do you feel seeing that now become a dominant ethos in a lot of the culture? The idea that if it's white and European, it's not valid, or you're somehow compromising by studying that. I know you recently taught a course that was very steeped in these traditions and these thinkers.
I did, and I don't like the anti-intellectualism that I think can find its way into some identity-driven. They think it's the left. I don't think it's the left, really. I don't think the left is about, I'm Black and I don't do European stuff, but that's another topic altogether. The anti-intellectualism that we see, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go, kind of thing, where I think Western civilization, this is not a defense of colonialism. This is not a defense of slavery. It's not even a defense of capitalism. It's a defense of the evolution of mastery and a depth of understanding and a kind of exquisite exploration of the full implications of certain ideas that I associate with Western science, with Western philosophy, with the canon that we inherit from the West. Now, it's not the only thing going on in human culture, and a person should be open about that. But we are, after all, here in the West. That was my inheritance, and I wanted to come to know it more deeply. And when I finally figured out what the university was for, 3 kids later and a full-time employment job, I had my chance when I came out of high school and I blew it. But when I finally figured out what the university was for, I was head over heels like a kid in the candy store with his nose pressed against the window. There was everything. There was mathematics, there was economics, there was history, there was literature, there was philosophy, there was political theory. There were all these books. There were these books I was reading. And Nietzsche was one of these books that I was reading, and genealogy of morals and, confrontation with the problems of modernity and so on. And I wanted to talk about it. And so
you said you really like the existentialists also, the idea of constructing your life.
Well, these were what I was reading. It was Northwestern University. It was 1970, 1971, 1972. And so my teachers of theoretical subjects and philosophical and political subjects, they were pointing me toward these thinkers, Sartre and Camus, among these thinkers. And I was just excited about it. And so when I would encounter an African-American student who was indifferent or diffident or contemptuous, oh, those are dead white males, I thought, how narrow, what a tragedy in a way. And by the way, you think you're being Black? I know Black. Black doesn't keep me from reading these difficult and important books. Quite the opposite, you know. So I had that attitude, and I still have that attitude today when I'm confronted by youngsters who tell me I don't need to be bothered with this or that because I am a this or I am a that. And I'm saying, you know, you've got a rare opportunity here in your years between 18 and 22 to engage or to begin to engage it's a life's labor with the intellectual inheritance of Western civilization, and you damn well better take advantage of it.
All right, so I'm gonna put you in a sticky position, if I haven't already. All right, so your co-host John McWhorter, I saw him speak at the Dissident Dialogues a couple of months ago, and I enjoyed his book Woke Racism. I'm pretty familiar with his ideas. I was really disappointed to see the position that he took on student protesters for Palestine. And at the conference, I found that the so-called intellectual dark web thinkers generally suddenly forgot all of their appreciation of these Western traditions of open inquiry and debate as soon as Israel became the subject. Suddenly there was an Israel exception to everything they had been saying for years. So McWhorter, at one point, they asked him if he thought woke was ending, and he said, "This is right when the Columbia protests were going on." And he said, "Well, I would have thought so until 2 weeks ago." And I found that so horribly disingenuous to just throw this woke label onto political protest as if there could be no other reason, as if they could have no legitimate humanitarian concern for the horrors coming out of that region, whatever your opinion of it, even if you're on the other side of it, to dismiss it as woke. It seemed to me, and he was certainly not the only one at that festival, it was pretty universal. Everyone, most of whom had been these advocates for the Western tradition of freedom of speech, had nothing but contempt and derision for these students. What is your opinion of these student protests, and why do you think so many who extolled the virtues of Western civilization and the tradition of the debate until October 7th suddenly found an exception on October 8th?
Yeah, you're right. You do put me on the spot, both with respect to commenting on my nearly 20-year partner in conversation, John McWhorter, and with respect to speaking in public about the conflict in the Middle East, period, full stop.
I mean, we could turn the heat up even more. We could ask LaJuan to go first. Hey, what do you think? And then toss to you. Make this really interesting.
Well, we'll get to LaJuan.
We'll get to all right. LaJuan,
All right, I don't want to preempt anything because I agree that would be interesting, and it's going to get interesting before it's over. I think two things. I think, how many babies are you going to bury under rubbles of collapsed buildings with multi-thousand-ton bombs falling on people who basically can't fight back? You're shooting fish in a barrel, I think. I can comment on that. You can't tell me I can't notice that. You can't ask me to unsee the photographs that I'm seeing. You can't ask me to unhear the reports that I'm hearing. That's not anti-Semitism. That's not anti-Zionism. That's humanity expressing itself. Don't ask me to not notice that. I think that. I think the protests have their warts and all. They have their excesses. They have their stuff that I'm not going to try to defend. of people. And of course, there's anti-Semitism. I agree that there's anti-Semitism. On the other hand, I'm so proud of these kids, I could burst. By the way, at Brown, half these kids are Jews. The kids that got arrested occupying the president's office, half of them were Jewish. Some of my Jewish students are amongst the leading protagonists in expressing outrage at what's going on. So I think that. The other thing I think is the irony is exquisite. This is apropos to the dark web stuff and to John and woke racism, for example, because the identitarian factor driving the pro-Zionist advocacy is like stupefying. These people are taking identity politics to another level altogether. You're going to tell me that my Jewish friend who has never set foot outside of New Jersey, but who dreams of immigrating to Israel and establishing a life in a Jewish country, isn't an identitarian?
Right.
Well, of course.
And the irony is that they take the DEI, John is a champion of this, the critique of DEI, and they flip it. So they say things like settler colonialism, which they think is a discrediting reference because it's a reference to a DEI idea, which if you're against DEI, you're going to be against settler colonialism. So you're going to be against the people who criticize Zionism from that point of view. And therefore, we can tarnish your position against Zionism by associating it with a DEI thing. And I, for the reasons I've already stated, find that to be extremely ironic. Since you're the master of DEI-ism, the presidents of the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard are gone because of your use of DEI tactics. And the other ones are hanging on by their fingernails and looking over their shoulder, afraid that you're going to come and get them next because of your use of DEI tactics. So DEI is bad until it's not bad.
I love that answer generally. I'd like to press you a little bit on the anti-Semitism point, but I would like to bring LaJuan in first. So what do you think about the student protests?
I'm also proud and supportive of the student protests. I wanted them to continue. I know the school's out. There are protests here and there. You've got Code Pink, who is still actively protesting. You've got other Jewish Voice for Peace, who is also protesting as well. I am very much in support of it, and I want to see more. I feel helpless at seeing the inhumanity of what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. And yes, Noam Chomsky called it settler colonialism, if I'm not mistaken. I'm supportive of how my husband responds to it. I know it's difficult for him because of his associations and colleagues. I want him to say how he feels, and it's devastating for me to see every day what's occurring to the Palestinians, and I don't know what I can do. I want to do something. I donate, but I just feel like I'm the typical American who is just sitting here voicing her outrage on screen, and there's nothing I can do that's going to really impact, that's going to cause some type of impact.
I think a lot of us are feeling that way as this drags on. Why is there this exception for Israel? Why did all these principles go out the window as soon as Israel became the subject? What is this deep connection that these people who are mostly not Jewish themselves have to the idea that there must be in my opinion, by definition, racist state? If you're calling it a Jewish state, that you can't have a certain number of non-Jewish people living in, because then it won't be a Jewish state. It's by definition a race-based state. Why are all these people lined up to defend this proposition and anything that it does in violation of every principle they were espousing on October 6th? Why did all that go out the window? I don't understand it. Why Israel? Why? Glenn, you want to weigh in on that? Glenn's like,
Yeah,
Glad
I'll
you
weigh in
take
on it. I mean, there are a number of things that you can say.
Well, that's
And by the
45
way-
minutes. I
by
think
the
we
way,
made a lot of progress this week. We'll see you guys back next week. Chew on that. Take this, like some of that home, and we'll see you next week.
This is a difficult subject. I told this story at my newsletter, glennloury.substack, that my wife and I were invited to a synagogue in West Palm Beach, Florida. Palm Beach Synagogue, very prominent synagogue in southern Florida, by friends. I'm friendly with the guy who is the chairman of the committee inviting speakers. And, I have the podcast. A lot of people follow me at the podcast who are, Jewish and, admire the work that I'm doing at the podcast as a conservative critic of American political culture. So I got invited to the synagogue to speak about Black-Jewish relations. The invitation came before October 7th, 2023, but the event was in, I think, January of 2024. So the war was in process. And I had a pet speech about Black-Jewish relations that I was prepared to deliver based on essays that I've written going all the way back to the 1980s and 90s that I could update, talk about affirmative action and stuff like that, But I didn't really have anything prepared to say about the conflict. And my wife was sitting in the front row as a guest of honor at the synagogue, and it was full of people. And a very distinguished, the rabbi and the founder of the program, the guy who was the benefactor and all that. And they introduced me glowingly beforehand and whatnot. And the question that I ought to have been addressing myself to, what about this war and Israel? I had, by the way, publicly called for a ceasefire within weeks of October 7th. I'd said in effect, Israel has to respond. Of course, it has to respond, but let's try to keep that within certain bounds of, human decency and so forth. And, whatever. The event came.
I called for a ceasefire immediately because I knew that was not going to happen. They could not be trusted, but that's okay. Go ahead.
I spoke, and I did not say anything about Gaza in the course of my speech.
Yep.
We went to dinner at the home of the benefactor after the speech, and nothing was said about Gaza during the entire dinner conversation. I'm looking at my wife out of the corner of my eye saying, oh my God, am I going to be able to live with this woman after the fact? Is she going to say, as Cornel West would say, you went down there with those big, important, and influential Jewish people, and you didn't have a mumbling word to say about the persecution of our poor Palestinian brothers and sisters? To which the answer is yes, I did exactly that. And I'm actually not proud of it. So after a couple of months of sitting with that and having to talk over the dinner table with my lovely wife about these matters, I decided that I needed to address it at the newsletter. And so I drafted basically a statement in which I said pretty much what I've said here about the conflict, and in which I also said, I didn't feel free to say what I really thought. And that's a problem. A problem not just for me, it's a problem for all of us. And so while I'm not answering the question was, why does Israel and Zionism get an exception from the judgments that might otherwise be brought to bear on identitarian, and you could call them racist, they're ultra nationalist kinds of ideas, which are now put in motion at the expense of hundreds of thousands of people. Why is there so little said about that? Why is there not a mumbling word to be heard from people who are otherwise staunch defenders of liberal ideals? I mean, you listen to people like John Mearsheimer. Is Israel really a liberal democracy? Well, no, it's an ethno state, you would be inclined to say, based upon the historical evidence at hand. And why is nobody saying that from the rooftops at this moment? I don't know the answer to the question. I'm merely sharpening the question itself.
I mean, it may be from what you're describing about the enormous pressure there is not to speak on it. It may be Upton Sinclair's observation that a man has a tremendous capacity not to see a thing when his living depends upon his not seeing it. I'm sure if you're within that world, because of how it's funded, because of who supports a lot of their endeavors, conferences, academic efforts. You're going to run afoul of a lot of those powerful factions if you speak out on this. So most people don't like to think of themselves as hypocrites. They will find a way to justify their hypocrisy in their self-interest. That's my theory from the outside. You're closer to these circles than I am. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yeah, I think it's accurate. I think people are worried about ruining their careers and about creating enemies where they don't need enemies, and about hassle. My life will be a lot easier if I simply avoid, alienating certain people. And, if I'm the president of Columbia University and I'm looking at the political lay of the land, or Princeton University, I'm looking at the political lay of the land, I have to take into account that there are organized interests who are powerful and influential that I don't want to alienate. I think there's something else going on. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, in his address to the joint session of the US Congress the other week, touched on this when he said, this is not a conflict between civilizations in the Samuel Huntington formulation. This is a conflict between civilization and barbarism. I think a lot of people, and they're not all Jewish, identify the Israeli cause with Western civilization, modernity.
Right. Yep.
I think that is a position susceptible to criticism because, as I've said, as is obviously true, we're not talking about liberalism playing itself out in Palestine, Israel. We're talking about ethnocentricity playing itself out at the level of a state government defined in terms of identitarian basis. That's exactly the opposite, or at least it's highly inconsistent with the ideals of liberal political theory, at least as they were taught to me when I was a college student at Northwestern University reading all these books. This is not what liberalism is. Liberalism is not a chosen people. That's a lot of things, and you can try to defend them, but it's not liberalism. And yet people identify, because of the close symbiotic connection between Israeli society and the United States and other Western societies, they identify the settler colonialists with the Western enterprise, and we're faced against a barbarous, ignorant, insane religious zealotry of radical Islam, and we had better choose sides and better choose sides quickly. I think that's part of what's going on too. They're choosing sides with what they think of as us.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you sound just like us now. So let me ask you, what is your least favorite dead white man to read? Which dead white men have you stopped reading? You still read Shakespeare? Well, I want to see if you're truly one of us.
I've read a lot of Shakespeare. I was blessed with a
all
good.
Right, so then you're still all right. So you're still hooked on the dead white men. Then all right, maybe I spoke too soon. No, I'm kidding, of course. I'm joking. No, you sound just like us. It is. I remember the viral confrontation between Sam Harris and Ben Affleck on the Bill Maher show when Sam Harris started talking about Islamic doctrine. He started criticizing Islamic doctrine, and Ben Affleck butts in, well, this is racist. And they said, no, it's not. No, it's not. And I admit at the time, I kind of took Harris and Maher's side. I'm like, no, they're making good faith critiques of Muslim doctrine. These are religious ideas that they don't actually mean this as criticisms of Muslims as people or as license to abuse, or in this case, mass murder Muslims as people. They're just criticizing ideas. But what this has exposed is that no, underneath that veil of, well, we're just talking ideas here, we're just debating here, there is actually a pretty bone deep contempt for Islamic civilization as being oppositional to Western civilization. Now, if you want to litigate those ideas, you can litigate those ideas in good faith. You cannot assume that what you feel is a certain Western superiority that you latch onto in your defense of Israel gives you a license to kill. And when your attachment to Western civilization fills you with the sense that you have a license to kill people, to mass murder people, because their values are not the same as yours, which is the first card they played after October 7th. Well, try being gay in Gaza. That's neither here nor there, whether you could be gay in Gaza. Doesn't give just because they don't tolerate certain norms that you are attached to as a Western liberal, that does not give you the right to go and do with them as you please. In this case, ethnically purge their land, killing tens of thousands of them. And I think you touched on that. This is racism. Russell wrote a whole article talking about how a lot of these social justice ideas that a lot of these students were taught are now being put into practice post October 7th. And the people who taught them to those students are saying, whoa, 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 what are you doing? Well, what are we doing? We're putting into practice the ideas that you put in our head, except you didn't really mean them ever, did you?
Yeah, I describe it as a Frankenstein project.
Yes.
They stitch together a little bit of dialectical materialism, some postmodernism, and some colonial theory. And my left perspective on this is that they carefully constructed a completely ineffectual left with no class consciousness and no material analysis. And they never expected that monster to turn on them. And then October 7th, all of a sudden, all of these ideas that they had conveyed to them came into practice, and they had no idea what to do. It was very much the monster turning on its creator. I think that what's called woke today is the end product of a decades-long effort to create a left that would have the posture of rebelliousness without the substance and without any real critique of power. I always tell them if they put it on the side of a Starbucks cup, it's not a threat to anybody.
So basically a diluted left, a watered down left.
Well, that's what they thought they had. That's why, in my opinion, that's why they're so obsessed with litigating the past. That's why they want to litigate slavery in the past. We have slavery now. You don't see them advocating that people get involved. That'll mess with supply chains. That'll mess with current interests. That'll mess with big corporations. They want people endlessly navel gazing about historical wrongs that can no longer be corrected. Yes, some of the after effects of them can be corrected. I think that should be done, but I don't think that's the intention. The intention is to keep people fighting over things that will not impact power in any meaningful way because they're not current. If they really cared, they'd say, look, we have human trafficking all over the world. They don't say that. They don't say that. They don't encourage people to take that righteous anger. You see how terrible that was? Well, it's happening now. So do this. Never. That's not the intention.
In other words, they don't have a real politics.
No.
A politics of the mobilization of people, of the education of people to understand their interests in a deep way, and then of the organization of people in an effective way to be able to move the needle on the structures in which we are all embedded. They have a faux politics. They have a pretend politics. That would be my way of putting it.
That's exactly right.
So getting back to your checkered past here, Glenn. So you wound up being the first tenured economics professor at Harvard. Position
tenured black economics professor.
Sorry. And that's a position you say you choked in. I've seen you say that in several places, including your own book. But it seems to have been a happy accident. You wind up at Harvard's Kennedy School, where you come out as a quote unquote black conservative. You publish an article, A New American Dilemma. Now, in 1984, you're invited to speak about that at a National Union Coalition meeting. In the audience was the president of the coalition, Carl Holman, and Coretta Scott King, the widow of MLK, who you say you made cry. So what did you tell them that upset them so much at this meeting?
Yeah, there was a lot there in that intro, Russell. I won't try to revisit all of it. Yeah, I came to Harvard as an economic theorist doing technical mathematical economic work, but I was appointed jointly in economics and Afro-American studies, and therefore had part of my portfolio to do with the culture and historical and political issues affecting Blacks in America. And juggling those two very different kinds of responsibilities is a challenge that I didn't handle very well. And I thought, I'm losing it. I'm not going to be able to live up to my potential as an economic theorist and so on and so forth. But that's what I meant by choking. A happy circumstance in the sense that it pushed me out of the economics department into the Kennedy School of Government and out of I-dotting, T-crossing kinds of mathematical derivative technical work into a public intellectual space where I started writing essays. And I got recruited to write a piece for the New Republic that you've mentioned, A New American Dilemma. And the argument of the piece, which I was presenting at the civil rights group's meeting where Coretta King was sitting right next to me as I was making my presentation, the argument of the piece was, the civil rights movement is over. Problems confronting poor Black communities have largely to do with behaviors of the people in those communities and not so much to do with the discrimination anti-discrimination crusade, racism, they won't give us the job, they won't pay us equal pay, et cetera, et cetera. And we need to reorient the movement so that it focuses on addressing those behavioral problems within the community to a greater extent than it now does. And it de-emphasizes the pursuit of the racist under every bed kind of, we got to get more civil rights bills, we need more civil rights. No, we don't. We need more hearings about police brutality at the US Congress. No, we don't, et cetera. This was my argument. I'm not saying it's my wife's argument because I know it's not my wife's argument, but it was my argument in the 1980s. And I made a presentation before the article was published. This is the summer of 1984. The article was published in December, but I already had a draft. Ronald Reagan is running against Walter Mondale for re-election. He wins in a landslide, as things would have it, later that year. And I'm in this small conference room in the Urban Institute's building on Northwest Washington, D.C. And I'm surrounded by all these civil rights leaders, and I make this. And I am, by the way, the first Black tenured professor of economics at Harvard. I am, 35, 36 years old. They're expecting something from me that I'm not delivering to them when I give them this speech, telling them that they need to pack up their bags and go home, that they have their heads up their butts, that they're pursuing exactly the wrong program.
And you said this to Martin Luther King's widow, not to her, but in front of her.
Not directly to her, but to the room in which she was sitting. She was sitting right next to me. I turned to my left and I looked down, and there are tears on the woman's cheeks rolling down her face. She's crying.
That's pretty hardcore.
And I thought, oh my God. I was an arrogant SOB in 1984. I was quite sure that I was right about what I was saying. And after all, I was the first Black tenured professor of economics, and I was the smartest person in the room by a long shot, et cetera, in my own mind. And I'm looking at this woman crying, and I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm making her cry by what I'm saying. Then I'm thinking, does she have any arguments, or is this just an emotive display? And I talk about all of this in the book. But yeah, that did happen. And it ought to have been a harbinger for me to recognize that the road that I had stepped onto, a road which culminated in me being nominated to take on the Deputy Secretary of Education job under William Bennett, was a road that I might have wanted to think twice about before I continued to walk down it, but it did not.
Okay, now in the book, you say, and tell me if you've changed your mind about this. I'm not sure if you were presenting your mindset then or you still have this opinion. You describe your perspective on the people in that room as they did civil rights 20 years ago, and now they've evolved basically into grifters. You don't use that word, but that's really what you're describing, that now they're making money off it, and they're really misleading the Black community by pointing them in fruitless directions that profit them, but not that community.
It was a neo-Marxian kind of critique in a way. And it was a critique, by the way, that I've heard Adolph Reed, the left-wing political scientist now I think he's emeritus, University of Pennsylvania, but a man of the left to be sure, make himself. about the Black intelligentsia and the Black civil rights leadership who have a good job. It's a well-paying job. It happens not to be developing a politics that would really restructure the larger circumstances of the people on behalf of whom they say they're advocating, but it's a pretty good job. And by the way, there are a lot of white liberals, some of them with deep pockets, who are prepared to step up and get behind this kind of faux politics barking up the wrong tree. So I did. In 1984, I didn't have as sharply developed in my mind this idea that these people are, quote, grifters, close. That's a harsh word, not a word that I use, but that they are.
Yeah, you didn't use that word, but
it's a well-paying job, and it's actually not doing their people any good at the end of the day. I didn't have that as sharply developed in 1984, but it did come to that before the 80s were out, and I became a Reaganite until I wasn't.
Okay, well okay, so that's a good segue. I can tell you've done this before. All right, so you were. This is something else I really didn't know about you. So you're hobnobbing with the Crystals. You're hanging out with Irving and Bill Kristol. You're hanging out with Clarence Thomas, pre-SCOTUS Clarence Thomas. Yeah. You're attending state dinners with Reagan and Bush. You're on the verge of being appointed the Undersecretary of Education, as you just mentioned. Then it all fell apart. So what happened?
Well, I was living this double life to which we have made some reference earlier in this interview. And it had culminated in me developing a relationship with a younger woman, a Smith College graduate in her early 20s, who reached out to me as a former student who was interested in ideas and wanted my advice, whom I met in a hotel bar for a meeting for the first time in Washington, D.C., and got to know her very well. In fact, persuaded her to come up to my room at that hotel on that first meeting, and we began a passionate affair. I was married to the late Linda Datcher Loury, my previous wife, who passed away in 2011, but to whom I was married for 28 years. And I was married at the time to Linda, and yet was taking up with this young woman. We had this passionate affair. I decided to invite her to move from New York City to Boston, where she could live in an apartment that I was prepared to pay for. So I had a mistress whom I was keeping. And it was all a secret until it wasn't a secret anymore, because she and I got into a fight. She accused me of assaulting her in the context of the fight. I denied that I assaulted her. I was ultimately, not going to call it exonerated. Charges were dropped later on when she decided not to pursue the matter. I could go into the details if you want to. It was 1987 by my calculation. That's 37 years ago, but there is no statute of limitations on beating up women. I didn't beat her up, but she said that I assaulted her in the context of this argument. And I was charged. I was charged by the Boston police. I had to appear in court. This was in the newspapers, and I had to withdraw from the government job as Deputy Secretary of Education because of the scandal associated with this notorious affair and its aftermath.
Now it seems when I was reading this, being somewhat familiar with the political class and its relationship to the media class, it seems like you were really being groomed in such a way that the road not taken, you'd be on Meet the Press today. They were grooming you to be one of those people, like the Crystals. Do you regret having not taken that road?
I have said it was a blessing in disguise. Let me just say this. So it's true that Clarence Thomas and I were friendly before he was on the federal bench, before he was on the DC Circuit, let alone the Supreme Court. When he was chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the early 1980s, that's when I met him. And we were not bosom buddies, but we became friendly. And, he said, if you're in DC, look me up. And I did look him up, and we went out to dinner. We went back to his apartment and had a drink, and we chatted because they're Black conservatives, not very many of us around. And I have more respect for Justice Thomas than your average person that you're going to snatch off the street, maybe even your average Republican, because he's a black guy. I can identify with his struggle and so forth and so on. And I'm not going to try to mount a full-throated defense of Justice Thomas here. I'm going to say this. I could have been and would have been, had the thing gone its natural course, a economics policy management counterpart to the legal career that culminated in Thomas ascending to the Supreme Court, where he's changed American history with his jurisprudence. That could have been me, and it wasn't me. At the time when this was going on, I thought this is a disaster and I've ruined my life. In retrospect, I realized how different my life would have been had I pursued the path on which I had set foot. And I am grateful that it didn't go that way for a lot of reasons, some of which I think are already implicit in the remarks I've made here to this point. Certainly, I would not be married to LaJuan Loury if I had gone that route. And I'm very happy to be married to my lovely wife, LaJuan Loury.
that is a man who has learned from hard experience how to keep a woman happy.
We call it good save.
Yeah. That's a good save. Well, since you brought up Clarence Thomas, this was a question I had because I saw you recently in one of your conversations with John McWhorter talking about how Clarence Thomas had this very rough background as well, as really a self-made man who came up from poverty. And you're really, I think, illustrating this hypocrisy of the liberal class in that they won't credit a conservative with a very creditable story like that. But at the same time, you also mentioned in your book how from very early on, you recognized that no matter what path you chose, you described being either an economist who is very conscientiously not being a black economist dealing with black issues, or being an economist who very consciously specializes in black issues, that it's kind of something you can't get around. You're going to be defined in that way, one way or the other. So when you've got a black conservative with a remarkable life story that I assume you find very relatable with your own background, does it deeply disappoint you that he's given such an appearance of impropriety? Does that hurt your cause to legitimize a black intellectual like Clarence Thomas when he conducts himself that way, or gives the perception of conducting himself that way?
No, it doesn't. I'm just going to tell you, and brace yourself. I think it's a hit job on Justice.
Don't tell me to brace yourself. You brace yourself. You're the one sitting next to LaJuan. I don't. Coast is clear on my end. I don't gonna brace myself.
I was telling her to brace herself.
Oh, okay, all right.
Well, as I was about to deliver the punchline, which is, I think, the ProPublica. Is that where a lot of this stuff is coming from? Is the Harlan Crow was explained? Man, I was at a conference in Dallas that Justice Thomas attended, and we were. People took 2 days getting out of that airport because of the weather and the firestorm, thunderstorm activity and whatnot. And Justice Thomas had to get back to the East Coast. And I'm pretty sure it was Harlan Crow's private craft that got him back home. And that's the kind of thing that people are saying, grifting. And I'm saying,
right.
He's got a rich friend. The rich friend, reached out and put his arm around him a little bit. Is it a good look? No. It's not a good look. Is it grifting and corruption? I don't think so. I think that's overblown. I think the politics of the Supreme Court, the Dobbs decision, Thomas's obstreperous, arch-conservative reading of the Constitution, I think people are out with knives out to get him, and they're trying to pull him down. And that, the damage to his reputation associated with a concerted effort to discredit him and the ideas that he stands for, is what I'm disappointed in, not his moral turpitude that's tarnishing what otherwise would be a admirable record of life achievement for a black person coming from beyond, because he has an admirable record of life achievement. He's had a tremendous impact on American law. there are a lot of people, not ideologues, who are supportive of Justice Thomas's jurisprudence in a number of the areas in which he has held opinion. I don't have to agree with all of it, but I think he's a great American, and, you know, like I say, brace yourself, and is an easy target. And if I had proceeded to Senator Loury or Secretary Loury or something like that, believe me, they'd be having the knives out for me too, and they'd be coming after me and using everything, including the double life stuff, that they could to discredit me. So I'm giving Justice Thomas the benefit of the doubt in that regard.
All right, well, we got to go to LaJuan now.
Yes. she just shook her head through that whole monologue. All right, so what are your thoughts, LaJuan, on the record of one Justice Thomas?
I purchased the book The Enigma of Clarence Thomas by Corey Robin. I watched Brianna Joy Gray's interview with him, and I listened to 4 long episodes of Behind the Bastards regarding Clarence Thomas's life. Clarence Thomas's life, and I just I tried to listen to my husband's defense of him, and I just don't agree. I think that based on his own admissions that he wanted to be rich and powerful, and he's rich and he's powerful. He's right where he wants to be, and with that comes corruption and entitlement, and I think he was a DEI hire as well.
Oh, I like
Oh, snap.
Flip the script.
Are you angling for a job in the Trump administration?
Yeah.
Look, if Thomas wanted to be rich, he'd resign from the Supreme Court, where they pay him. What do they pay him? $300,000 a year, $400,000 a year? I'm not saying that's nothing. That's a good wage, but, you know. And he'd be with Eric Holder or one of these people, partner in one of the hip operating top law firms in DC or in New York. He'd be making $10 million a year. He's not rich.
Yeah, but that doesn't come with the status of being a justice on the Supreme Court. So maybe that's his way of having it both ways. All right, you got the status of being on SCOTUS, and you make some money off your powerful friends, or you get to live that lifestyle through their largesse.
Yes.
Okay. Not the worst sin in the world, if you ask me, and certainly not unprecedented.
Remember now, he didn't buy that.
No, not unprecedented. No, I'd grant you that.
Okay. All right. So no sooner did you get out of the scrape with the young lady than you took a drug bust. You describe a crack addiction, and you went into rehab and underwent a religious conversion. Now, not long after that, you said this in an interview. As a Christian, I believe the decline in traditional values requires a religious antidote. Christian nationalism may be a way to achieve both aims. There is a genuine cultural affinity between blacks and conservative Christians, aside from the kooky Pat Robertson types. Blacks have a good deal more in common with them than with the ACLU or the Jewish liberal intelligentsia. We should find ways of exploiting it. Do you still believe that?
Wow, I had forgotten I said that. And that would have been 1990 or 1990.
There's the early 90s, yeah.
And
all this being what it is, you'd have still been a better VP pick than J.D. Vance. If it's any consolation.
Thanks a lot for that, Keaton. I really that's damning with fake praise, I'm going to say. But okay. Look, I just wanted to go on the record saying Christian nationalism to me in 1990 did not mean the same thing that I would mean by the use of those words today in 2024, Christian nationalism. A lot of water is under the bridge. At the time, the thought was, cultural reform is the key to solving the problem of the inner city, and religion is a tool to moving in the direction of cultural reform. And you can find allies, political allies on the religious side as well as you can on the economic policy or political left-right side. And we Black Americans would be wise not to overlook the possibility of, for example, Charles Colson's Prison Fellowship Ministries, right, which I served ultimately on the board of for a few years and which I admired even then in the early 1990s. And, they're going into prisons and they're trying to minister to the people there. And they got an affirmative view about, not over incarcerating and, second chance and third chance and things like that. And that's grounded in a Christian theology. And I'll have to say this. I mean, and again, my wife is not going to like it. I'm looking at the abortion numbers and I'm saying the outsized role that abortion is playing in life management decisions that African-American women are making, and that's not a good sign in terms of the quality of relations between men and women, which is the foundation for social reproduction because families form out of that and children are born into that context and whatnot. And there's something that's not entirely healthy here going on. And so a culturally conservative critique of that is not necessarily the enemy of Black people. And looking at the way the political coalitions form, the relatively culturally radical elements and the African-American civil rights elements are fused together within the Democratic Party into what is a political coalition, but they don't all have the same interests. They don't all have the same problems, this kind of idea. But you asked me a direct question. Would I still affirm those beliefs? And no, I would not utter those arguments today because they would mean something very, very different to me and to the listening audience today than they might have been understood to mean in 1992. Pat Robertson, after all, was running for the Republican, not Pat Robinson,
Pat Buchanan.
Pat Buchanan was actually a player in Republican politics in 1992. And no, I was not an advocate of Buchanan's candidacy, but I did have some more respect perhaps then than I would now for the Christian nationalist outlook that he took and that J.D. Vance reflects in his own politics.
Do you still consider yourself a Christian?
No, and I talk about that a bit in the book. I don't want to take up too much of our time on the minutia of the book, but I went through a crisis of faith, and I came to a point where I had once believed that Jesus Christ literally was raised from the dead and literally lives on to this day as an intercessor between me and God Almighty, as a way of me having a relationship with the creator of the universe, as a salvation and so forth. And I came to believe that belief was itself irrational and I couldn't affirm it. And so I disavowed my Christian faith in the fullness of time. And I say that with trepidation because I know I'm going to get letters from people every time I say in public that I'm no longer a Christian, telling me that it's not over yet, God still loves me, and that he's there waiting for me as soon as I'm ready to come to him. And I try to talk about this in the book, about why I, a rational human being, can't believe that someone was born to a virgin. Can't believe that someone was raised from the dead. Don't ask me to believe that. I now would say in my perhaps ultra-rationalist sensibility, but at the time when I crawled on my hands and knees into the church and was met with loving embrace and found the support that I needed to get through the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life, which was stop using cocaine. At that time, it was a salve. It was literally God reaching down into my life where I did not deserve it and providing me succor and comfort and taking me unto himself. I believed that in 1990. I came to a point where I couldn't believe it anymore, and I'm still at that point.
Okay. LaJuan, what's your view on what Glenn was saying about abortion? Because this is a lot of, and I don't know if you would take it to this point, Glenn, a lot of Black conservatives will connect all of this to Margaret Sanger and eugenics and the attempt to basically genocide the Black population in a roundabout way.
So I know W.E.B. Du Bois was supportive of Margaret Sanger's efforts, and I think he looked at it. He approached it differently. It was about noticing that when you have more and more children and you're unable to support them, it pushes you deeper into poverty. And
Right.
so I love that you can have children and people want to have children. I see nothing wrong with that, but it bothers me that you've got women who become pregnant and are unable to decide how to proceed. And especially if she's a teenager or just in her early 20s or something, and she's about to do something different in her life, it changes her trajectory. Her life's a lot more difficult attempting to raise a child, especially by herself. I believe that conservatives are just more concerned with the baby itself. They're not concerned with what happens after the baby's born. And you see it in the policies that they support. You see, I think that also the church has a role in this as well, in terms of advising people to abstain from sex or to not even support the use of contraception. And if you're listening to your pastor tell you that you're fornicating, that you're having sex at a young age, and it's terrible, but you don't want to teach those kids about how to protect themselves if they are having sex.
Right.
There's a major problem here. And I always ask my husband, what do you expect? What do you want someone to do? What do you expect them to do if they have a child and they've got to take care of this child and they've got a hard life ahead of them?
Well, so what do you expect, Glenn?
Well, I want to make something clear. I think there's one thing: should a woman have the liberty to make a decision to terminate a pregnancy? And there's another thing. When the abortion rate is through the roof in your community, is that a healthy sign, or is that a sign of something that's deeply wrong in your community? I hold both positions. That is to say, within limits. I mean, you get to the third trimester and, there's some issues about the viability of the thing and, whatever. And I think you can legislate on that. I don't want to start a fight with anybody here, but I think there's a real issue about a life. So
you're pro-choice with limitations.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. I'm pro-choice with limits on that third trimester thing. So, I'm not one of these people that says that a fertilized egg is a human being and you've got to protect it from day one. On the other hand, I think there is something problematic about the reliance upon abortion as a way of managing life's struggles to the extent that I have seen evolve among African-American women. They're the ones who are aborting the pregnancies. But of course, the men are implicated indirectly in this behavior. Sure. And that's not, in my mind, a healthy state of affairs for the community. And I think, remember, I'm the guy that says culture, values, behavior, norms, and we have to be able to reach into that. And I want to be able to talk about that with the community, men and women talking together about how we relate to each other, how we reproduce ourselves through children, and how we care for the children that we decide that we don't want to terminate early in the pregnancy. So I don't have a problem with my wife saying, you didn't want him to abort the kid. Well, what are you going to do for the kid when the kid is here? Because that's a whole lot of weight and responsibility on somebody, and they need help if you're going to ask them to carry that burden. I agree with that 100%. To her, I often respond, well, that's what a lot of the religious-based efforts to, reach out to women in distress are premised on. They're premised on telling her you're not in this by yourself, this kind of idea. But I think the issue of a woman's right to have the discretion to control what's going on with her body, so long as palpably another life is not being sacrificed. You can't do human sacrifice. You can't kill a kid because the kid is inconvenient. A kid. And
Yeah,
then
when you say a kid, you're talking about late stage.
That's
Right.
what I'm talking about. And that's a negotiable thing. And it depends on a whole lot of stuff. And people are going to differ about that. But that's my position. I just want to make that clear.
But I see that these religious organizations that offer support, when you're not alone in this pregnancy, you're not alone in the pregnancy up until birth. After that, you're alone. I don't see any further support after that. I don't see anybody offering to provide diapers and formula and doctor visits and other types of needs for children. Afterwards, it's more about indoctrinating them into the religion, teaching them about all the Sunday school stories and everything about Jesus, but not actually providing for their needs. I'm a former Seventh-day Adventist, and so
wow.
yeah.
Yeah, tell me about it, bro. That was not my experience when I was more actively involved in religion. The congregation that I was a member of, the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Boston, would have gone to that woman's house every week to make sure that she had groceries, would have been encouraging her in every way to, support the education of that child and whatnot, would have come around her as a community of support. They're not all like whatever experiences you might have had in the SDA thing or whatever, so it's not one thing. These churches are communities. On the whole, I think they are a good thing for the people who find succor and comfort in the warmth of the embrace of these religious communities. I can't be against that. I'm sorry.
I don't think you're going to find succor in very many of the mega churches. You'll find them in that wonderful church, Bethel AME. I met the pastors. They are fantastic. I just don't find enough of those. I find more of the mega churches or churches that are concerned more about your membership and your tithes rather than actually assisting their members when they're in their time.
I've been in Harlem for 17 years, or the most churches per capita anywhere in the country here. They do a lot of community outreach, but I mean, certainly there is what you're talking about as well.
Well, it also depends on where you are, I think, to a large extent. I grew up in the town of Newburgh, outside the city of Newburgh, which the school district's very diverse, a third brown, a third black, a third white. And what I always observed is at the Planned Parenthood, which is in the city of Newburgh, which is a predominantly black city, you'd have mostly black and brown people go in, and the people out protesting, saying, abortion is murder, we're here to help you, come to us, we'll help you through this. They're the upper middle class white Christians from the suburbs coming into a very poor city. Mm-hmm. And you know what they would get? People from the women going into Planned Parenthood, fuck you. They would just scream at them because they didn't buy that. Oh, these upper middle class white Christians are here. Oh yeah, no, they're going to take care of me. Yeah, they're going to make sure I'm okay. They're going to help me through this. They didn't buy that. Maybe that was more unique to my to where I grew up, because I grew up in such a diverse area. I think that suspicion exists.
Yeah. All right. So to go to none of these topics are light. Some of them are. All right. So you were we're going to go to economics. You were at the forefront of the Reagan Revolution in a lot of ways. You were right in the middle, influencing a lot of the thinking around that. In the book, and I'm not sure if you were describing your frame of mind then or now, you describe yourself as neo-conservative. Do you feel today that deregulation, free trade, pro-regime change agenda that we associate with figures from that movement like Bill and Irving Kristol was a terrible mistake in light of how it all turned out? We have an exploding Middle East. You got Boeing planes losing parts in flight almost every day, partly because of lax regulation and outsourcing. You have the top 1% of income earners with more income than the entire middle class at this point. And many people would say where that started was with the neocons and the neoliberals and the Reagan Revolution. Do you think these ideas were a mistake? Do you think a lot of the problems we have as a nation today were a result of a misguided neoliberal, neoconservative project that began there?
With reservations, no, I don't think that. The reservations have to do with the war in Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, nation building, and remaking the world in our image, and the zealotry with which the Bill Kristols and company of the world advocated for foreign policy orientation, which I think has been disastrous. I would say that full stop without qualification. On the question of taxes and regulation and wealth redistribution, I'm looking at the 20th century and I'm saying, where has economic growth taken place? Well, one place it's taken place is in East Asia, in Korea, in Japan, in China, in South Asia, in India, where hundreds of millions of people have been drawn out of poverty and into a globalized economic system, which is capitalist, which is oriented toward profit, which is oriented toward trade, and which is the source of our prosperity, in my opinion. So I think markets, open markets and trade, the pursuit of profit, corporate initiative, innovation, technological development, modernization, the building of cities, the growth that we are seeing throughout this part of the world that I have referred to in South Asia and East Asia. This is good for the future of humanity. It's the only way that we're going to actually be able to grapple with some of the problems. How do you feed 8 billion people? What do you do about climate change in the long run? There's no non-capitalist solution to that problem. I think.
Well, I mean, China's a Marxist-Leninist country.
It is
capitalist features.
With Chinese characteristics, I think, is the way that Joe and Lai once put it. But but it's a capitalist economy. That's what the engine of it is. It's markets, it's prices, it's profit, it's corporate pursuit with restraint. And I'm not an expert on Chinese economy. I can't go into the details about exactly how they do the regulation or whatnot. I want to say a couple other things. You can overregulate. I was around when Jimmy Carter was president and when the big push to deregulate transport and trucking and railroad rate setting and airline rate setting. I mean, look at air travel today. We would never be able to do what it is that we're doing now under the regulatory regimes that existed previously. With one of my early applied economics exercises was analyzing the consequences of the control of natural gas pricing at the wellhead. And I concluded that on the whole, it was a very inefficient way of trying to protect consumers. Nothing wrong with protecting consumers. People have to heat their homes. They don't have enough money. That's an issue. Something should be done about it. But price regulation, I thought, was a very bad way of going about it. I thought that the supply siders had something to say. You can overdo the taxing thing. There are such things as incentives and so forth. I'm a trained economist, so please forgive me if I think economic mechanisms allowed to do what the magic of the Adam Smith invisible hand is a good thing. But I want to credit financial regulation, 2008, what Wall Street is able to get away with, the outsized role of money in our politics, which is deployed on behalf of protecting corporations from the kinds of regulatory interventions that make sense and that can be shown to work. Not all of them do, but some do, and ought to be given credit for doing so. And being appalled at the way in which the ideologues led the country into one war after another, after another, after another throughout the world, trying to spread democracy and so on, which I think has been shown to be a historic disaster of monumental proportions.
So you give a mixed report card to the Reagan Revolution. Go ahead, Keaton.
No, I was just going to say, it is not, to me, to critique the excesses of capitalism is the same as critiquing capitalism itself. because there's no self-correcting mechanism within capitalism to prevent those excesses from eventually swallowing the state, which is essentially, I would argue, what they've done now. And we certainly saw, I mean, the 5-alarm fire symptom of that in recent context would have been 2008. But what would you say to that? Because markets, to me, don't seem to be unique to capitalism. I think you can have markets under alternative systems. I think the exponential nature of capitalism makes crises like this inevitable.
I'd say if we look at the 20th century and we look at the socialist experiments throughout the developing world, or we look at them in Eastern Europe, or we look at them in the former Soviet Union, or we look at them in Latin America, that's not a pretty record either. I would say yes, excesses of capitalism or capitalism. It's okay to criticize capitalism, but compared to what? That's what I'm always asking my lovely wife over here, who is railing and foaming at the mouth about the problems with capitalism. I've said, compared to what? What would you have do? Would you have political apparatchiks making these decisions?
I think it's fair to critique
popularity contest in an election to be the one who decides how to allocate resources.
I think it's fair to critique any system, and I think it's fair to look back at the 20th century and critique socialist systems and communist systems. But you mentioned twice, I look at the 20th century. Well, why don't we look at the 21st century, which is a quarter of the way underway already, and look at the horrors that capitalism has wrought upon the world in this century? The Iraq War, the financial crisis. Look at how corporations took advantage of the pandemic. To me, the situation we're in now, what is the bigger threat to the world? Capitalism or socialism? To me, it's not even close right now.
Well, where is socialism operating in the world right now with good effect?
Well, I mean, we brought the China example up. Now you could say that's capitalism.
Vietnam is having a lot of growth.
But look,
also,
what I would say though, because I don't consider myself, and I've parsed this before. I'm not a doctrinaire or anything. I don't like to argue theory, because I think all systems fail. I don't think any system works. You say, well, communism doesn't work, but no system works over time. Capitalism won't work over time. Everything organic dies. All systems eventually fail. But I would say, the Marxist sort of critique of capitalism and the predictions that he made about the life cycle of capitalism, I think are pretty obviously true. Now, does that mean I can draw up a blueprint of an ideal system? No, I think, the Marxist in me says that the first step is to organize workers, strengthen labor, and out of an organized labor force, demands will grow. And some of those demands will yield good outcomes. Most of those demands will probably yield bad outcomes. Most of these systems over time all of these systems over time are going to fail. Most systems are going to fail in the short term rather than the long term. So I'm not a doctrinaire. I'm not trying to advocate for some sort of top-down system that I could prescribe as a solution to all the world's problems. But I do think starting from a point of an organized labor force that is equipped to empower itself through self-determination, not through reliance on a neoliberal sort of bureaucracy that doles out welfare to those who they deem worthy of it. That's where I would start. Now, if you're going to ask me where would you finish, I don't have an answer to that, and this is why I don't talk theory that much, because I don't have an answer to that, and I wouldn't try to bullshit my way into one.
That's all good, Keaton. I mean, I'm not making a joke either. One of my dear friends is a gentleman, a real community organizer, he would say, when informed that Barack Obama was a community organizer. His name is Ernesto Cortez. He runs the Southwest Industrial Areas Foundation out of Austin, Texas, and with activity throughout the west and southwest of the country. And, he's a progressive through and through and through, and he's an organizer. He's one of my dear friends. We talk every other month or so by Zoom for a couple of hours. What books are you reading? What are you thinking and whatnot? And you sound like him. You know, I mean, he's not a systems man, but he is an organizer. And he does believe in coming up from the bottom and getting people to come to understand what their interests are, and then becoming effective at being able to pursue their interests.
Exactly.
And I respect that. I want to say one other thing before it gets lost. Professor Richard Wolff, the Marxist.
You interviewed him. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I debated him with my wife moderating the debate.
Yeah.
Question, capitalism or socialism? And you remind me of the arguments that Professor Wolff offered on behalf of socialism. The ones that I offered are similar to what I've already said here, so I won't rehearse them.
Well, that's a high compliment. I like being compared to him. Did you own him? Would you say you owned him in that debate?
Let LaJuan answer that.
I would say, I wouldn't say he owned him. I think that he benefited into some of his arguments. However, I also didn't agree with either one of them regarding the Fed.
Why did they both want to eliminate it? I'm assuming.
No. They both agreed that the Fed was necessary. And
okay. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
The pictures from Jekyll Island certainly didn't convince me of that, but okay.
Well, Glenn, you actually speak somewhat admiringly of Das Kapital in your book. Mm-hmm. So what did you say? Not endorsing it, but you gave it respect. You gave it some props. It wasn't as ideological as you expected. What didn't you say that the kind of nightmare of out of control government corruption and ownership and looting of the state by corporate powers and by elite classes is the late stage capitalism that Marx predicted? Whatever you think the solution to it is, didn't he get that right? Aren't we living in that?
I suppose you could say so, yes. And my first encounter with Marx was reading in a political theory course the essays in what does he call it? God, what's that book? Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. So this is, a good 20 years before Das Kapital appears.
Oh, okay.
And he's developing, this is young Marx, and he's developing the foundation of the theory that he's ultimately going to elaborate in collaboration with Engel about capitalism. But he's talking about alienation. He's talking about work. He's talking about what's the relationship between the guy who owns the machine,
right,
and the guy who owns nothing but his labor, who has to come to the machine in order to be able to feed his family, and about how exploitation works, which is the creation of value through the collaboration of the worker and the machine, but the appropriation of that value and profit by the guy who owns the machine, and the driving down the wage of the guy who has nothing to offer but his labor until he's only at subsistence and can just barely feed his family and come back to work the next day. And that whole formulation fascinated me, and it got me to thinking, because this was early in my career of studying economics, and all the economics I had learned was neoclassical and neoliberal economics about markets and the virtues of prices and so on. And there was no attention to the legitimate question. It takes many factors to create product, value, surplus. How that gets divided amongst the factors is an interesting and important political question, not just a quote unquote scientific question. And Marx was pointing me toward that question. So I was interested in Marx from that point of view, even though not a Marxist. Then after I finished my PhD and came back to teach as an assistant professor, I had a mentor who was telling me, you ought to get out of the narrow world that we modern economists live in, and you ought to read widely. You ought to read Weber, you ought to read Marx, you ought to read history, you ought to, and you ought to talk to people here at the university who don't see the world the way that we see it from inside the economics department. And he put me on to a graduate student in the history department who wanted to read Capital, Marx's three-volume Capital, with an economist. The historian and economist would read together, we'd compare notes. And so I spent 6 months one year reading through Capital with this historian who was interested in economic development in Africa. And he was interested in how the introduction of market exchange and commodification changed the nature of social life in developing countries under a colonial influence. And I found the Marxian view rich in implicit hypotheses that a social scientist could adopt for thinking about that problem. So I have great respect for the grappling with the conundrums of modern economic life that in the 19th century, Karl Marx undertook in the project that resulted in that great book, even though I'm not a Marxist.
All right. Let's go to something fun that I think you'll both have, have a lot to say about. So Kamala Harris was just anointed, coronated, what have you. And there were a lot of voices, not all from the Black community, but many from the Black community, who were not thrilled about her first event and how she tried to, some would say, pander. So let's take a quick look at one of the featured entertainment gigs there.
Yeah, we're gonna keep the volume off so that we don't get copyright claimed by YouTube. But this is what we're talking about.
This is Megan. Right?
So this is Megan the Stallion, and a lot of people felt twerking is maybe not the best way to associate yourself with Black culture and the Black community. And I watch sometimes. I don't know if you watch him, Greg Foreman. He has the Black Conservative channel. He's a young Black conservative. And he showed some video of how they talk to Asian communities when they go to talk to Asians, how they talk to Latino communities when they talk to Latinos. And it's very respectful. And it's none of this. It's not this. And, many people had argued after they saw this, isn't this an insult? That you're saying that this is what the culture is, and in this context, this political context, this is what you would assume appeals to that community. What are your opinions about that?
Well, code switching. Why do we need that? It's unnecessary. First of all, I think the whole candidacy, the whole concept of Kamala Harris is an insult to me as a Black woman. I didn't want her, and I thought that she would have faded away after she dropped out of the primaries. But here she is, foisted upon us as someone who represents Black women, and I don't see anything I don't see any of me in her. I'm insulted. I'll say it again. I'm insulted. And
why are you insulted?
Well, I hate to. I'm trying not to. I'm trying to be careful here in saying that she's not. She didn't experience the actual African American experience of growing up here in the United States. She spent some time in Canada as well.
She went to high school there, yeah.
Went to high school in Canada. Her mother is Indian. Her father is Caribbean descent. So she wasn't. She didn't experience busing and the discrimination that someone like me would have experienced. She went and attended Howard University, I guess, to get in touch with her Black roots or whatever. But she also locked up. Her prosecutorial record is abysmal, and that's also an insult. And now here she is, a cop who could possibly be president. She doesn't relate to I don't relate to her anything she does at all or is at all.
Glenn, what are your thoughts?
Well, we're talking about a Black woman running for president, so I give a large default to my wife here in the conversation. But
Having read your book, I am really impressed with how far you've come.
I mean,
that is a man who has learned his lessons.
There's nothing edifying about the booty shaking stuff that's going on. It's pop culture. It's cheap almost by definition. You might think that in running for the highest office in the land and appealing for the support of a community, you would aim a little bit higher. You might think that. On the other hand, if you're trying to get butts in the seats, if you're trying to engender a crowd and draw attention to yourself, you want to go with what's popular and whatnot. This is not going to be a Ben Shapiro critique of Megan Thee Stallion, and Cardi B, and getting out there and twerking. I'm not going to be a prude here. I feel the same way if you brought a bunch of gangster rappers out, and they were celebrating thug life, walking around with pistols in their hand and using the MF word and whatnot like that. I feel the same way about that. It's not about sex, but it is cheap.
Yeah, and I would say, I haven't judged any twerking contests in my day, but this seems like fairly innocuous as twerking goes. I don't know. Yeah, maybe I'm not the best judge of that, but yeah, I mean, it seems fairly PG.
Yeah, it's a little classier than some of the other stuff you've seen Megan do.
Yeah.
Sure. But it's I just see it as entertainment.
Well, I hear they're doing WAP for the inauguration.
No. I want to say we're talking about Kamala Harris. So now the last time I checked, it was a lot of Democrats who were saying that she was not an especially compelling figure in politics, that she was not especially effective as a manager, as a leader, visionary. She couldn't put sentences together.
Right. Her staff kept quitting. Yeah.
There was open talk about replacing her on the ticket and whatnot. And now she's the standard bearer for half of the politics, at least half of the politics of America. And I'm fascinated by that. And part of what commends her to our attention, she's the first South Asian, she's the first Black. And let me just say that these identities are skin deep. They don't go very deep at all. They don't mean anything really. And so these are ad campaigns that we're observing here. These are marketing devices that are being foisted upon us as a substitute for developing real political leadership. What does she stand for? Has she read Marx? Or
well, presumably, because her father was a Marxist economist. Yeah.
They never mention the fact that Don Harris, I know Don Harris. I have sat in Don Harris's office when I was on the job market and I got interviewed out at Stanford in the 1970s. Don Harris was on the committee that vetted me. He's a real mathematical Marxist. I mean, he's what my friend John Romer, the Marxist economist, would call a no bullshit Marxist. I mean, he's not just word salad. He's got the equations and the analysis and the graphs and the data. He's a serious, at least he was in his heyday. I mean, he's up in years now, and I doubt if he's very active as an intellectual anymore, but he's a serious Marxist intellectual, and that never gets mentioned.
I think we'll be hearing about it soon. All right, so our once and possibly future president weighed in on some of this at the National Association of Black Journalists. You know what I'm going to play. So let's take a look. You got it, Keaton?
Yep. Their own supporters, including Republicans on Capitol Hill, have labeled Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the first Black and Asian American woman to serve as vice president and be on a major party ticket, as a DEI hire. Is that acceptable language to you? And will you tell those Republicans and those supporters to stop it?
How do you define DEI? Go ahead. How do you define
diversity, equity, inclusion?
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Is that what your definition?
That is
give me a definition then. Would you give me a definition
DEI.
of that? Give me a definition.
Sir, I'm asking you a question,
a very direct question. Define it for me, if you would.
I just defined it, sir. Do you believe that Vice President Kamala Harris is only on the ticket because she is a Black woman?
Well, I can say no. I think it's maybe a little bit different. So I've known her a long time indirectly, not directly very much, and she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
She has always identified as a black woman. She went to a historically black college.
I respect either one, but she obviously doesn't, because she was Indian all the way, and then all of a sudden she made a turn, and she became a black person.
Just to be clear, sir, do you believe that
I think somebody should look into that too when you ask, continue in a very hostile, nasty tone.
That was classic Trump. All right, so thoughts on that? On what he said? Is she a DEI hire? Is what he's saying valid? Because you seem to be saying that yourselves. And something I pointed out when we covered this is, the reaction in that room is very mixed. Some people in the room clearly liked that.
Yeah.
Well, let me go first and I'll be brief. I think there is this sense, and by the way, this was also present in the Black community early in the Obama phenomenon when he emerged, and a lot of people saying, how Black is he? And his father's Kenyan, his mother's a white woman from Kansas and so on. Grew up in Hawaii, Indonesia, and whatnot. He made choices in his life that allowed him to present himself as Blacker than he might otherwise have done, et cetera. Now, obviously, there's an element of choice, and I guess the question comes up as to whether you respect the choice that she's made. I mean, it seems to me Trump was right in a way. She did choose to be Black. She had options, and she made the choice that she made. The question is whether or not we respect it. Is she a DEI? Okay, this is just Glenn Loury. You all do with me. But it's obvious that she's a DEI. Biden said he was going to appoint a woman vice president. Then he bragged and crowed about appointing a Black woman vice president. Was she the most qualified compared to, I don't know, an Amy Klobuchar or an Elizabeth Warren or whatever? You can debate that. What had she actually accomplished in her life relative to what they had accomplished and so forth? You could have a big debate about that. Obviously, she was chosen because of her race and her gender. That seems to be obvious. You could say, so what? You could say people get their foot on the bottom rung of the ladder one way or the other. Everybody has a story. The question is, what do you do after that? And I would say, yeah. The question is, what do you do after that? And that record is not all that compelling either. If she had been a white man with the same reviews coming into the Biden crisis, the question of whether or not it had to be the vice president who succeeded would have been resolved, in my view, in a very different way. But because she's a Black woman, you couldn't force her out without anticipating that a third of your party was going to be in outright revolt for you having pushed her out. So she got the DEI protection in that way as well. So it seemed to me, I wouldn't put it that way. That's pejorative. DEI, you're calling somebody a name. But as a descriptor, it seems to me obvious. Now, I'll just finish. I said I was going to be brief, and I wasn't. Trump didn't play that very well. He should have let somebody else make those points.
Well, that's
he
what I
didn't
said.
Right.
play it very well. So he had good cards, but he didn't play it very well.
LaJuan, what are your thoughts there?
No, I agree. Trump did not play it well. But I will ask, why is it that a white man can't ask that question?
I think if you're not in politics, you can. If your purpose is to win people over,
Sure.
I think, as Glenn said, he's got other people on his team who could have made that case, probably. Then again, I've said this from the beginning. Trump says a lot of things like that everyone thinks are going to hurt him, and then his polls go up. So a lot of times people misread how these things play to the public. Like I said, that room was not overwhelmingly negative in its response. And I think because of some of what you were saying, that was a conversation around Obama too. And it just is not usually covered in the press because nobody wants to go there. And he went there because he's Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was necessarily out of bounds as a white person to ask that, as so much as it was a misstep for a politician to ask that because it's off message. You're being lured into a culture war when the top issues on people's minds this cycle are inflation and the border. And if I were advising Donald Trump, I would advise him very strongly to stick to those two issues and not to get sidetracked into these culture war things where you are potentially much more vulnerable. Now, where I do think it is not the place of a white man to say what he said later in this rally. We covered this on the show 2 days ago, when he said she should take a cognitive test. Now, that is an example where I think that does show a level of racism in Kamala's case, because people say Kamala is an airhead. People say Kamala is a bimbo. She's not very smart. She's not really any dumber than the average politician. In my, experience observing politics, most of these politicians are fairly mediocre intellectually. And I don't see Kamala as being particularly dumb to the point where you would say she should take a cognitive abilities test. That played more racist than this.
Yes.
This didn't necessarily
Yes.
play as racism. This played to me as a step way off message in a campaign that could very easily win this election if they stay on message. So this particular piece, the video that we just saw, struck me more as a political misstep, as a foray into bigotry. When he started saying she should take a cognitive test, to me, that is out of bounds in a racist way, because she's not any dumber than what? She's dumber than Lindsey Graham. She's dumber than, whoever. I mean, pick one of these. Chris Murphy. Is she dumber than Chris Murphy? Not really. They're all the same in that way, more or less.
I agree.
All right.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Final question that we know is going to start a fight because we don't want to lose our gig as marriage counselors.
Yeah.
Who are you all supporting in the election, if anyone?
Okay, I haven't decided. I have announced I wasn't voting for Biden, but then that's now moot. Am I voting for Kamala Harris? I don't see myself voting for Kamala Harris either, but I'm not prepared to say I'm voting for Donald Trump. And there are other options out there. Cornel West is a very good friend of mine. I've known him for 40 years.
Oh, there you go. Well, that would be.
Wow. Did not see that coming.
Yeah, didn't see that one coming.
So,
there you go.
so we can,
I'm not
label
saying I'm
this.
voting for him either, but I
Loudly
could.
endorses
You
West.
could. Yeah, this was really a career ender. You're pro-Palestine, you're pro Das Kapital, and you're pro Cornel West. I mean, I hope that house is paid off that you're living in, that you're sitting in now.
Go ahead, Glenn. What were you saying?
No, I was just going to say there's a lot of substance to Cornel West. He's read a lot of books and he's thought very deeply about them. He's a very serious and thoughtful person. That doesn't necessarily make him a good politician or a good political leader. But if I were to cast a ballot for a third party candidate, he certainly would be in the running for my ballot, knowing that he's never going to be president, but that at least I would have expressed myself on behalf of something that I could really believe in.
Wow. All right.
That
And
is
you,
very
LaJuan?
surprising. All right.
I'm voting third party. It won't be libertarian either, but if Shama Sawant were running for president, she would have my vote.
Yeah,
Oh,
me too, but
okay.
she's not eligible, unfortunately. She's Indian born.
Right.
She's supporting Jill Stein this time, yeah.
Yeah, so I watched your discussion with her regarding Jill Stein, and I'll vote for Jill Stein. I'm sending a message. I know that this duopoly, two cheeks of the same ass system, is no longer appeals to me, and I see the way our country's going, and I don't see anything getting done by either of these parties. So I want something different, and I'm going to send my message.
All right.
All right. Well, this was fascinating. It was a pleasure to meet the both of you. We would love to talk to you again soon. Thank you so much for taking time out of your vacation for us. Appreciate that very much. The book, once again, is called Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black pro-Palestine Marxist Cornel West supporting conservative. You should get that reprinted. You're gonna have to redesign the cover of that. You're gonna add some qualifiers to that conservative label there, because you've kind of torched your reputation as a staunch conservative
You have
over these past
ruined me,
couple hours.
Katie. I'm finished. I got to find a new line of work now.
Pro-choice.
Yeah, right, exactly. Confessions of a pro-choice, pro-Palestine, pro-Cornel West, pro-Marx conservative. There you go. Well, you're a fascinating guy. You guys are a lovely couple, and it was a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for joining.
Our
Thank
pleasure.
you so much.
Thank you.
Please clap.